Thank you both. They were excellent presentations. They're not easy topics. They're quite technical. They're quite heavy. They were presented really, really well. And really interesting to see lots of overlap in terms of bridging theory into practice, and a lot of similarities in your recommendations and the roles that potentially some of the stakeholders could play. Before we open up to kind of more general discussion, Mike, our non-expert, I might give you an opportunity just to maybe respond to the guys' presentations and the recommendations made.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alison, and thank you, Nuffield, as well. So William mentioned earlier on that he wasn't an expert either. I amn't. He was asked to speak because he's writing a cheque. I most definitely didn't write a cheque to be here, so I'm not sure why I asked, but if William is writing any more cheques, I'll gladly take them. Yeah, so look, as Alison said at the start, I'm a senior research officer in Moorepark, and my main area of work is around nitrogen and legumes and pasture management. And I think there's not much I can say that the two lads haven't already covered in their topic, and it's maybe just add a little bit of context around some of it. I think most of us know we have a huge target to meet in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture accounts for just shy of 38%, 37.8% in fact, and we have a 25% reduction to meet by 2030. Now, we've only met actually just over 5% or 5.2% the last 2 years in reduction. So we have 25% reduction to get over the next 5 to 6 year period. So it's a huge uphill challenge in terms of an overall greenhouse gas emissions. And in terms of the breakdown of that, methane accounts for 65%. That's not really been covered today, but in terms of NO2 is the main factor that is accounted for in that greenhouse gas emissions, which accounts for 30%. And suppose the two talks that the lads gave today in terms of an overall reduction in chemical fertiliser, the use of legumes, but I suppose, and then the water quality side with David. We know that if we reduce chemical fertiliser alone, in terms of take out 30% of the nitrogen that we're applying in Ireland, we can net 8% of our greenhouse gas emissions reduction straight away. Now, that's very easy to do in terms of take 30% chemical fertiliser out of the system, or in terms of nitrogen out of the system. But the consequences that can have in terms of the knock-on effects if we don't have the building blocks in place to do that. And Bryan mentioned earlier on in terms of soil fertility is a huge importance in terms of legume establishment and also plantain and overall soil fertility. The building blocks of where we are, we're currently at 20%, or actually just shy of 20% in overall total soil samples that are tested are optimum for PK and lime. And they're only samples that are tested, so it doesn't take, in fact, the rest of this country that's not sampled. So in terms of the building blocks, we're already at an uphill challenge if we want to try and achieve those targets that are having negative consequences thereafter. So soil fertility is a key factor that we must get right in terms of overall, in terms of legumes, and we can talk about that thereafter as well. But if we take out 30% of our chemical fertiliser, and we've seen that over the last 2 years, so we wanted to get down to 300,000 tonne of chemical nitrogen coming into the country. Last year we were at 280. This year we're going to be somewhere around the same. The end of the year figures aren't getting out, but up until the end of Q3 they were much aligned to where they were going forward. So we can take out surpass our terms of chemical nitrogen reduction targets, but there has been a huge reduction in overall annual tonnage on pasture-based farms over the last 3 to 4 years, in excess of over 2.5 tonne in some parts of the country, and on average 1.1, 1.2 tonne from where we were 3 years ago. Now, so that's on a good news story. We've reduced our chemical fertiliser inputs. We can reduce our overall nitrogen emissions from that, our nitrogen oxide emissions from that, but we've reduced overall just shy of 8 to 10% of our dry matter production that we're producing on our farms. And if that is the case to sustain stocking rates, that hasn't really changed. There's a huge level of imported feed coming in across the country in the form of concentrate, and also in terms of purchased forage as well in our system. Now, in terms of the nitrogen balance, and we can get onto that as well, it's only farm gate nitrogen balance. It doesn't actually take in effect legume proportion or nitrogen fixation in the system. But if we look at that, if we take out the chemical fertiliser, it'll reduce our overall nitrogen balance system within that, and that's a good key factor. But what it doesn't take effect is, and David mentioned that the top farms were good for one and also good for financial performance as well. That's not always the case, and we can target, and targeting individual components of an overall plan is never really a good aspect. In terms of the nitrogen, we've reduced chemical fertiliser. If we target an overall reduction in farm gate nitrogen surplus, we'll reduce overall production and potentially environmental economic sustainability of that system as well. So there's a huge cohort that needs to be got together in terms of achieving overall those targets as well. So it's not just the one thing that needs to be got. So again, the liming target that was put out when we were trying to reduce all these meet our greenhouse gas emissions. We wanted to get to 2.3 metric tonne. In 2018, we were 1.7 metric tonne coming into the country. Last year, we're at 1 tonne. So we're actually going backwards in terms of lime being applied in the system. And again, if we want to get legumes into the sward and increase nitrogen fixation, that is a double-edged sword that's not going to overall in terms of benefit. And there's actually lime is down again this year. So we're not meeting all of those targets. In terms of protected urea, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions loss as well, we've gone from 1.7 to 22% last year. And again, it's going to be something similar this year again. So we still have a long way to go in some of our key metrics that we have to get. But there are certain key building blocks that we need to put in place. The lads have touched on some of them, and in terms of the cow, urine accounted for 30%. Feeding anything higher than a 14 or 15% crude protein, particularly when there's a period of ample grass growth and the back end of the year, is going to increase that nitrogen excretion in the animal as well. So there's all of these metrics that we're trying to achieve, and I'll finish this up into discussion, but all of these metrics that we're trying to achieve, we can't look at an individual component. And if we look at an individual component, and even the talks that were on this morning as well, if we look at one key factor, whatever the talk is, we'll lose out on the other aspects of it. So it has to be a multi-factor approach. To reduce chemical fertiliser, there's key building blocks we need to put in place: soil fertility, legume proportion, and yield stability across years as well. Water quality, another aspect as well. If we just try to reduce nitrate surplus, we potentially have a negative impact on overall environmental performance of that farm, sustainability of those farms as well, but also importing excess feed in the form of increased crude protein in the concentrate as well. So not to go on too much, but the two talks are very much aligned in terms of the building blocks that needs to be put in place. And both of the lads mentioned in terms of CPD training for farmers as well. It's a little bit more difficult to try and account for that, but I think if we go in a direction to get to that end point, we may not meet our 2030 target, and that shouldn't stop us to not try and achieve it. But there are building blocks that we're already missed the boat on some of them in terms of soil fertility, currently at 20%. That needs to be much higher. And we're starting from a back foot in some of those positions at the moment. We need to increase much more. And just one point, everyone talks about water quality, that we have 54% adequate, good or exceptional water quality status, and everyone focuses on the 54. But David mentioned we had 46% that's poor. And that's the cohort that we need to improve on, and the areas that they are in their system as well. And this blanket approach in terms of what David does or what Bryan does, two completely different farms and soil types and latitude, it needs to be tailored and data-driven evidence on individual farms and cohorts and sectors within the enterprises.
Thank you very much. We might just move away from the technical side for a minute. Like we've heard it alluded to today that, you know, a lot of the presentations, everything comes back to this. A lot of this is about people, okay? So what were your own, like you're adopting a lot of these practices on your farms. You've met farmers who've given you good profiles of what these things look like. Mike's mentioned lots of building blocks that needed to be done for this to be workable and efficient. So what were your own personal drivers for adopting some of these practices? Bryan, I might start with you now. You've had a bit of a voice rest.
Yep. Yeah, the focus at home was always on producing milk and feeding the main herd of cows, and that was always, and it still is today. The incorporation of clover within our own system is there for a couple of reasons, and it's there to, first of all, build the resilience of the farm. It's to reduce our overall farm footprint, be it in emissions, but also then to do it in a more sustainable manner. And to do that sustainably, and Mike touched on it as well, there's no point of us having the clover out in the field if we're not actually feeding the cows. And that's one of the active management decisions that we make on the farm. And in terms of the people that I was fortunate to meet out there, and that was the key thing that was there behind all the good farmers that were incorporating clover. It was there to reduce the inputs and the footprint of the farm, but to make the farm more profitable and sustainable going forward, that they could feed their herd, be it either milking cows, dairy cattle or sheep or whatever, but they could meet the demand of it and have a good living coming in for their family and their employees and the people working with them.
Perfect. And David, what about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Similarly, I suppose, when you think about your own farm, like every farm is different, and making change, and it can incur costs first of all, and you need a long-term vision for the farm, first of all, like, you know, and I was lucky enough, you know, our farming enterprise is profitable and it's viable and there's room for 2 generations so there was a future there for the farm, first of all. And then, you know, when it comes to the environmental action, then we know we have to make progress in these different areas, and then we can start to work them into our system and how we can be more aligned to what's going to be asked of us going forward, like, you know. So first, like, you know, every farm is going to be different, and it's hard to, you know, while we can advise farmers on what to do and that, like, you know, everyone has to, you know, it needs to be, you need to have the farm viable first of all, you know, and that's not the case everywhere. So I suppose.
And in terms of those farms you spoke about, the discussion group down in Cork, and what did they look like?
Which looked at a discussion group based on Moorepark is probably looking like they have a lot of the boxes ticked. So
Mike's not an expert, you don't have to.
no, Mike had nothing to do with these lads. But no, sure, look, they're the farmers that are engaging, you know. They're the farmers that none of us are really worried about when it comes to environmental action. They're engaging in the discussion group. They're doing a lot of things right already. Fair enough. There is a variance in performance and what they're doing, but it's the farmers that are not engaging is where I suppose we need to target our efforts, because unless, you know, as Mike said, look at the engagement around soil fertility. This is not a new message from Teagasc. It's ongoing a long time, and, you know, it's a slow burner, like, you know. So I suppose that's where we need to focus going forward.
Yeah, and I suppose, sorry Mike, you were coming there.
Just to come in on you asked what are those farmers doing, and I think, as David said, they're farming very well. Like, and if we want to reduce farm gate in surplus, what farm gate in surplus, it's all of the chemical nitrogen that comes in the gate. The main cohort of that is chemical fertiliser, then followed by concentrate, and in that you have milk powder and whatever else, calf ration. Then you have forage and livestock that comes in. So every kilo that comes in the gate that has some level of nitrogen included in it. And the balance then is every bit of nitrogen that's gone out the gate. So most of those on dairy farms is milk production. On dry stock farms, it is animal sales, carcass out the gate, livestock sales, forage being sold off system. And the nitrogen balance is one minus the other. And if we want to improve our overall farm gate nitrogen balance, we want to reduce the level of purchased feed that we're bringing in. We want to reduce the level of concentrate that we're feeding our animals, growing as much grass as possible, reducing our chemical fertiliser to a level that is sustainable for that individual farm based on the soil fertility and the level of legume that they have in it. And then to maximise the outputs is to increase output on a per hectare basis, whether that be milk production or livestock sales out of that. So you want to reduce all of the level of nitrogen that's coming in a manner that's not going to reduce overall herbage production and increase the level of performance or output that's going out the gate. So if you reduce your chemical fertiliser to a level that's not sustainable, you're going to have to bring in additional feed. And you're going to also, on the other side, you're going to reduce the level of output. So that's not going to improve your overall farm gate balance on that system as well. So they have to be balanced in terms of what's coming in the gate to what's maximising coming out the gate.
And I suppose that brings us on to kind of a more, I think, Bryan, you mentioned it last week, a holistic approach to farming. Like, and you know, there has to be those multiple building blocks in place, and we can't just look at like one crude indicator and that we're ticking one box and assuming that therefore we're doing everything well and we've met a target. So I suppose to kind of get that holistic approach, we need lots of collaboration from multiple stakeholders. And you both mentioned the importance of continuing professional development. I suppose it's kind of something that's been mentioned about when it comes to farming for a couple of years, and it hasn't progressed too much. But we now have like multiple agricultural skill nets. We have agronomy services within co-ops, we have Teagasc, we have multiple stakeholders. So how do we make CPD effective? How do we get people to buy in? What does that model look like? And how do those stakeholders work together to get the most out of it?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to the farmers that are out there that don't have the level of either grass production or clover content within their sports. They know where they need to be going and they are interested in it. They're just missing those few key points, and they could have been told them back in ag college, or they could have picked them up on a nitrates bee build-up course or something. They just don't have the time to sit down, put it into a clear plan and implement it fully. And it's just a breakdown of that process. So be it in a clear, and most of those tools are out there. Like Teagasc has a very good soil maintenance table that tells you what level of P and K you need to put back on your field for what stocking rate you're at. So those tools are there. We just need a better way to get that flow going between those farms. And particularly with the likes of the sustainability programs, and I saw it in a couple of places, be it either within co-ops or within processors, where they had the sustainability program that was set up, first of all, to reassure the customers of the people that were buying the meat or the milk, that the food that they were buying was sustainably farmed. But they had a clear message within that back to the farmer itself, to just deliver that message in an easy way that could be followed through every day on the farm.
David, would you like to comment on yours?
Yeah, well, sure. The question around collaboration around the how do we engage farmers in training? Like, sure, there's multiple levels of it, and it could be layered onto what's already there. Like, we have, ASAP is very, farmers work best, and it's been proven time and time again when it comes to, if they're to really take up something, it's the one-on-one engagement that works well. We all automatically think of the Teagasc advisor or the private advisor, but like, there's a lot less time now spent actually around technical stuff with your advisor now. There's an awful lot of time spent in tied up in schemes. So like, there is something there in that our advisors receive in-service training about a lot of this stuff, but then does it get back out and in interaction with the farmer. Then, ASAP is another good example of one-on-one interactions, and layering more on into their meetings and visits can be very important as well. Then I just thought of today, there's a few farmers here in the room that have engaged in the likes of the Teagasc Sustainable Farming Academy. Like these farmers who are going out of their way to engage in third level 7 courses through the Teagasc co-op, but based out of UCC. So like they're the other end of it, going out and in search for this. But yeah, like as you mentioned, SkillNet, there's loads of avenues there that we can layer on more of these positive actions.
Yeah, and I think the key thing was that kind of interaction piece, because I think a lot of education is available and provided to farmers, but it tends to be a feed down mechanism, and there's probably not enough emphasis on maybe monitoring the impact of the education afterwards and actual practice change and adoption. Andrew, how are we doing for time? Sorry.
We're fine. Thanks, Andrew.
Are we?
I'll bring in the farmer case study that I introduced, the Clarks, and it was their mindset that they knew the information was out there, and they would put themselves out there to get that information. And that was quite present in the top performers, is people that go out, they have a vision or a purpose behind them. And an incident back at home in 2013, between TB restriction and poor weather, we were quite badly set up for a winter in terms of we didn't have enough silage. But we knew that we had to put the key things in place to guarantee that next year we had to do it. But we knew we had to start off with soil. And most farmers know that, they just can't get the information, or they don't know where to look for it as well. So some of those key roles, like the sustainability programs or the academies, just to deliver that message.
Very good. Might take some questions from the floor if there's any. We have mics roaming around. Yep. We start with Andrew, just we're waiting for the mic to get over.
Hi, yeah. I was just one thing that comes up sometimes in the clover debate, and we're talking about nitrate loss. Autumn time, is there an issue with clover and nitrate loss in the autumn? Just to look at the other side of.
Yeah, so if we look at that's coming from nitrate leaching, and the both lads kind of mentioned onto it. Like, and if we look at nitrate leaching, David covered that, and it's from the animal. We can have sedimentation loss at animals in rivers, drainage, and then chemical fertilizer application as well. So in terms of legumes, and if we know if we have reduce chemical fertiliser inputs by 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, and we maintain the same level of dry matter production, we're fairly confident there's backward calculations and we have models there to predict how much nitrogen we're fixing from a certain percentage clover. And if we have somewhere between 20-25% average sward clover content, we're fixing somewhere in the region of 90 to 120 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year with that. Now, nitrogen is still nitrogen, whether it's coming from a bag or from the rhizobia bacteria and the nodules that's on the legume plants. The difference is when we apply chemical fertiliser through a spinner, we're applying 20, 15, 25 kilos of chemical fertiliser in one go. And although not everyone adheres to the traffic light system that David mentioned earlier on, if we get a poor weather event or poor grass growth, high rainfall, whatever it is, or depending on the sward conditions, soil fertility, there can potentially be an increased risk of loss depending on the weather event that's there afterwards with chemical fertiliser. Now, if you have legume that's fixing 80 to 90 kilos of chemical fertiliser per hectare per year, most of that fixation is coming from end of May, June time onwards up until autumn when clover content is peak and then comes off again. That nitrogen that's coming from legume, once it is released into the soil, it is still susceptible to nitrate loss. The risk, or the difference is there's two key factors. Number one, we can't control when that is released into the soil. And number two, the level that is being released or fixed on a per hectare per day basis is relatively small compared to going at 20 or 30 kilos of chemical nitrogen per hectare in one split. And on a per day basis, on a per hectare, we're fixing somewhere between 0.6 and 0.9 of a kilos of nitrogen per hectare per day. So the levels are quite small. Now the risk is, and at the moment we're getting exceptional growth rates and it's not much of an issue, but when we come into the winter and generally soil temperatures are greatly reduced at that time point anyway, so we don't get a huge level of fixation because soil temperatures are much lower. We need 8 degrees and above for high levels of fixation from legumes in the sward. So there is still a potential for loss of nitrate leaching from legumes compared to chemical fertiliser, but not to the same extent. So legumes are not going to decrease our water quality issue anymore. They may potentially improve it slightly, but it's not the silver bullet. The silver bullet with legumes is the nitrate, or the N2O emissions from the nitrate savings element from within that. But again, and the second point then to bear in context, so we sow legumes with a companion species. The majority of it is white clover, perennial ryegrass. And if we look back in 2012, when I started in Moorepark, we were selling or importing into the country and distributing around 160 tonne of white clover seed per hectare tonne per year, and about 6 to 8 tonne of red clover seed. Last year, that was a 416 tonne of white clover seed. It's a 160% increase. And red clover went to 121 or 122 tonne increase. So it's a 1,000% increase, but albeit from a very low level. So there has been a huge uptake in the level of legume on farm, back to what Bryan was talking about earlier on. And most of that has come from the schemes, the multi-species schemes and the red clover scheme, and the price of chemical fertiliser. But all of those legumes are sown with a companion species, namely perennial ryegrass, sometimes mixed herbs. When we have an exceptionally high level of legume in the sward, we need the companion species to use that nitrogen that has been fixed. And if we have an exceptional level of legume in excess of 45 to 50%, we don't have enough companion species to utilise that extra nitrogen. The clover will only use what it needs and the rest is released into the soil. And if we don't have high enough grass in the sward, then that nitrogen can't be taken up by the companion species. So everything, again, we want more legumes, but there's a balance of what we want as well. And everything we talk about is an average of 20-25%, peaking at somewhere around 40-45% in August, September. But if we're peaking, and we've seen it on individual cases, on individual farms with exceptionally high legumes being included in seed mixtures, up as far as 60 and 70 and 80% clover in the sward. They are a recipe for disaster. Number one, from a bloat point of view, from what Bryan said earlier on, but also potentially from a water quality point of view, because we don't have enough grass in the sward to utilise that extra nitrogen that's been fixed. And again, we can potentially then cause a water quality issue. So yes, it can increase overall water quality, but there's certain caveats that we need to bear in mind in terms of soil fertility, number one, and then that we have a right balance of legumes and companion species, namely ryegrass, in those swards.
Would you like to add further comment?
I'll just second what Mike just said. Saving my time. Some of the down to the companion species that Mike mentioned at the end. Some of the farms I visited, particularly in New South Wales and Tasmania, were bringing in the likes of the plantain that David spoke about earlier, to hopefully suck up some of that free nitrogen. Other plants that were mentioned in conversations I had with agronomists were oversowing with maybe oats on extended grazing with high legumes at the end of the year, oversow that the oats will suck up that nitrogen, give you that extra growth over the winter. It's all, it hasn't been done yet in Ireland, but there is options that we could suck it up. But yeah, the fact that clover is just putting in a little bit of nitrogen the whole time, the risk is smaller.
Just to add on to that, and not to be taking all the time, sorry, David said we have loads of time in the afternoon, so we're fine. But, and just add on to the plantain point, and David mentioned 30% potential reduction in nitrate leaching from plantain. Most that's coming from the animal side in terms of diuretic. So plantain is a lower dry matter, the animals eat it, they need a certain level in their diet, and they urinate more. So the same level of nitrogen is coming out in the urine per day or per the 24-hour period, but we're increasing the urination events by 15 to 25%. So it's little and often rather than a large dump of it. So plantain can definitely reduce chemical nitrate leaching because of its steeper rooting zone on the animal side, but also on the soils as well. The issue is the persistence. And that's the issue when we go to multi-species swards, and also red clover in grazing systems as well, is persistence of those. David mentioned we need to build or increase carbon stocks. The one way to do that is longevity in swards, that we don't have to cultivate them more frequently. If we have a plantain sward or multi-species swards that has gone after 3 or 4 years and we need to rejuvenate it, we're increasing carbon loss in the atmosphere as well. So plantain can definitely add a role, and up to 30%. We need a minimum of 30% in the sward per hectare to get those significant benefits that David mentioned. But the persistent is the key issue with some of those.
We had another question, yeah.
Hi, so me again. I actually work within the water industry predominantly with what I'm doing, and I'm quite interested to hear. It's not a technical question. It's it's where are you taking yourselves with regards to nitrate trading and things like that. So within England and Wales, we do nitrate trading. The water companies are investing in agriculture to manage how much N and P they lose and how that will improve water quality in the area. What I'm interested to hear from you guys is how do you see agriculture in Ireland getting ahead of the N and P market, because that's where we're on the back foot within England and Wales and Scotland. And how do you imagine yourselves actually capturing the politicians and the public's imagination that farming is part of the solution towards water quality and sustainability and not part of the problem?
David, I might let you lead on that.
Yeah, well, I'm interested in the nitrogen trading because I'm in the business of buying nitrogen. I haven't got on to selling it yet, so I'd be interested to hear more about that. Yeah, so I've no experience on, I think, what you're touching off in terms of the water companies and the trading of nitrogen, unless anyone else in the panel has anything to add on that. But in terms of the buy-in, I think we're actually going well on the buy-in. Like, I think, yes, we've been probably slower off the mark in some regard around water quality, but you know, we've had legislation around it for a number of years, but let's face it, the retention of the nitrates derogation from an Irish point of view has hastened all this discussion at a rate of knots in the last couple of years in particular. Farmers have woken up to the fact that water quality is going to govern that going forward. But from the buy-in point of view, from a political point of view, we totally have the buy-in, I think, even in the recent months, in that we have recognition even at the IFA's most recent concert conference at the Curragh Racecourse. You know, we had our Taoiseach there, and he tells us that he's totally committed, along with other political leaders, that to the retention of the nitrates derogation, and is backing farming in that regard around water quality, and recognises that there are other sectors as well who have a big contribution to this. So from a political point of view, I think we do have the buy-in. From the rural economy point of view, I think we have reasonable buy-in as well, in that, you know, farmers are, as much as we see in negativity in the press, like, you know, move outside of Dublin, and farmers are very well regarded in their local areas. You know, like, you'll see the main GA teams playing at Crow Park. They're sponsored by agricultural co-ops. Yeah, throughout our rural communities, farming is embedded, and I don't think we've lost the public on water quality, and I don't think we should, because we can prove it in recent years. We are doing our bit, so from the public point of view, I don't think we've lost it. From the political point of view, I think we've won it back to an extent, and that has been hastened by the nitrates derogation, and there's a full commitment to retaining that. So yeah, I think we're not going. But at the end of the day, it's about our actions and putting it in place and try and reverse the trend. Has anyone else anything to add on that?
We might actually. Is there any more questions? I think we have time for one. Oh, okay. There's lots.
Just a quick one
We
there.
take a few.
Thomas Murray,
Okay.
2023, Nuffield Scholar. Is the tillage industry missing a trick here in terms of both getting the N off your farm, David, and growing clover to try as a cover crop with a bit less risk than maybe growing cereal, or a bit less risk than growing the break crops that are already grown in rape and beans, and getting the N off the farm while providing a protein crop for the dairy industry, and maybe get a protein payment on that then?
Yeah, well, I'll let Bryan
Yeah,
comment
Brian's
on
itching to get at that one.
Yeah,
clover, but from
I
the...
came
sorry.
across, yes, I came across that instance, particularly with that slide and the picture from the piggery within Denmark. That was a green feed of clover and grass that was grown as a crop within an arable sector. It was dried using geothermal heat pumps, and then was delivered to the piggery and feed out through the system. And I came across that again in Scotland as well, where same again, green clover and multi-species swards grown as a break crop within arable farms and fed to dairy cows. So there is a trick there that we could cooperate between all sectors to cover that gap. And by having that homegrown protein feed in terms of a high grass clover content, we're reducing the amount of feed that we're bringing into the country that Mike spoke about as well. So we're
Just
not...
on the tillage side, I would just err on a few caveats in terms of make sure, and most places that have been tried, there have been monocultures of red clover swards that are put in, cut for 2 years, and then put back into cereals or tillage, and there's a huge abundance of nitrogen available in the soil for the water quality is the issue with that, like we mentioned earlier on. So there's a couple of caveats. It potentially will work from a feed point of view, but from a water quality point of view, within that tillage farm may not add a whole lot of benefit.
Might take.
And just from the around the movement of nitrogen from one farm to the other, I presume you're talking about organic manures. I think there's a fear around that in some way. Like, the regulation is serious around it. When as soon as our slurry moves off the farm, I'm pretty sure the amount of nitrogen halves as well. It's not worth as much to us to remove it off the farm. Livestock farmers don't feel that they can afford to lose that nutrients off their farm either. So there's absolutely makes sense, but there's an awful lot of hoops and circles to round to
Take
get
one
it
more
right.
question from Aoife.
Hi guys, great presentation. Aoife Feeney, 22 Scholar. I suppose this is a question to the panel because it's topical for all of you, but I was wondering how long it would take to mention nitrates derogation with this topic. The one thing with the nitrates derogation is we can lobby the Commission, we can lobby Europe and our own politicians as much as we want, but ultimately our application for a nitrates derogation will come down to looking at that water quality trend and that 54% versus that 46%. And turning that around is up to those of us that are managing the land on the ground and that are impacting water quality. And this is for the panel. What do you think, or how can we in this room, you guys included, get the farmers who aren't already involved in water quality programs or aren't already taking actions? What can we do to speed that up? We have to apply for nitrates derogation before the end of this year, post 2026. We don't have much time to showcase what we are doing, and we're doing an awful lot positive as an industry, and I know that from my own studies with my Nuffield scholarship. But what do you think we need to be doing as a sector together to really drive that on?
David,
Yeah, well, sure. It's a good point, Aoife, and when around the derogation, the fear is probably the horse is bolted, and there isn't time on our side for this round to show significant improvements in water quality, and that is a big part of it, and around nitrate in particular. the slurry storage one comes to mind. You know, there's action coming forward, hopefully next year around storage. Again, that's not going to be in time. So lobbying is going to be a big part of this, unfortunately, in the retention of it. But I mentioned there the traffic light advisory to farmers. I think we need to start, like, there's a knowledge gap here for certain farmers too, believe it or not. And we need to access the hard to reach farmers. And I think through the co-ops is a good way of doing that, because they can get to the farmers that are not engaging, and they can, you know, we can tailor that advice to the specific area. So that's one, even for this winter, I think our co-ops could roll that out if they were serious about it. I don't know if there's anyone from here on here in the room, but there's a name tag outside, all right. But you know, we can make progress immediately if we really want to. The lack of, I'll let the lads come in there as well if they want.
Yeah, the ASA program that's out there has engaged a lot of farmers. Probably where we're probably lacking in some farmers' areas is that they don't know that at-risk place within their farm. So the PIP maps, the David brought up in his first slide, farmers had more access to those that knew the vulnerable areas of their farms and could take those simple practices of just holding back at-risk periods or just allowing a buffer zone. They're the small things we can get implemented straight away, but we need that farmer buy-in. It's the question we need to ask each and every one of us as farmers is what can I do to guarantee that I'm not the cause of losing the irrigation?
I'll just come back in there again. I think something we could also put in place, if we were serious about it as well, is put a water quality management plan in place on every dairy farm before our application or within the next year for the nitrates irrigation. There's something in around 17,000 dairy farms. The ASAP program has been running since 2018, has had a big impact. There's 50 advisors there. I would think that the urgency of this issue would suggest that maybe we should pull some of the advisors that have been enrolled in the signpost advisory service and have them work on the water quality side for a period of time. Double up the number of advisors, we could get down to something in the region of 100 plans per person. And if we could go to Europe and show that, look, we have had a visit to every dairy farm in the country, built a water quality plan for them, and they are serious about taking on this issue, I think that's something that is also achievable if all the stakeholders are serious about this.
Was there one final
Yeah,
question?
and just when you're waiting for the mic, on that, Aoife, and on David's point, like, so the Teagasc have launched the new water quality campaign, which is a 7-year multi-actor campaign. It's 8 steps in total, and it's hoping to do what David has just mentioned there in terms of employing water quality advisors that are linked with the ASAP program and linked with the signpost program to go out and just look at water quality issues on individual farms. And that's broken into nutrient in terms of fertiliser, soil fertility, farmyard management in terms of runoff. I know David mentioned it's not as much of an issue, but it still is an issue in terms of sediment loss. And then also in terms of land management, drainage and water courses. So that is in place, and I think it is in place this year, and it is a 7-year program that I think is and will be put into our submission going forward as well. So I don't think that the horse is bolted in terms of the derogation, but there's a lot more to do in terms of what's happening currently on farms as well.
And then just last question.
Yeah, thanks very much. The whole question of biological additives for slurry treatment, Teagasc has been consistently against it and simply recommended sulfuric acid. And yet I see it featured again in one of the 2 farmer presentations, I can't remember which. So what's it bringing to the party in the places that you looked at it? What's the constituents of the additive itself, and what do you reckon it's contributing? So at what cost?
I might put that to who mentioned it.
Yeah, well, I mentioned it, Matt. And look, it's an area that personally I don't have a huge knowledge base on. I know that there are farmers in Ireland, particularly through the Danu EIP project over the last few years, who would be advocates of it, and through the group Base Ireland, who are a soil-focused group predominantly. And you know what it's doing is the biological treatments that they suggest can help to change the slurry from an anaerobic product to an aerobic product. And because slurry, when you look at a natural farming system, it's not a natural phenomenon. It's something that we've created through from a housing point of view. So the idea there is that is there something we can do to manipulate this to have a lesser effect on perhaps suffocating, reducing the air in the soil, etc., and making it more palatable to soil microbes and applying it at maybe more modest rates than what we are. So look, it's something that is anecdotally, I have to say, is backed up a lot, but I don't think we have had sufficient research into it, given the significance of slurry in our system. And it's, we talk about our comparison to New Zealand and other grass-based areas, but slurry as a resource, or you can look at it as a issue, but it's definitely, given the fact that we're going to probably catch more of it, we're trying to get a better value out of it. There's no doubt that it's definitely understudied as far from what I can see in Ireland.
So I actually was the one that told Alison that Matt Dempsey has a question. I'm sorry, I didn't know, but I'm only messing. So there is work currently going on additives, slurry additives. Most of that work has been focused around methane in terms of Teagasc research, in terms of methane reduction from manure management. And there has been improvements looking at some of that. And there is currently 2 projects that have just commenced in the last 12 or 18 months on the more soil nitrogen biological side of it. So I do agree there's not a huge amount of work on it, but there is work now beginning on it within that to look at it. Maybe David said we're slightly behind the field, but again, there's probably more pressing issues that needed to be done over the last number of years, but it currently is being looked at the moment, Matt.
Okay, I think with that we will wrap up our session. I'd like to congratulate Bryan and David once again on excellent presentations.
Thank you.
And I would also like to thank Mike for his obviously non-expert opinion. So thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.